What if I told you a band got so dangerous the police didn't just arrest the singer, they beat her bloody in the street for being obscene? They were banned in London, blew up their record advance on a pier, and their attempt to collaborate with a legendary metal band caused that band to implode. This was no ordinary band, they were a declaration of war. Here's how it all blew up.
Like, subscribe. Thank you.
So picture this. It's the late 1970s in New York City. The city's grimy, broke, pulsating with this raw, angry energy. And out of this primordial soup of punk rock and art world chaos comes this guy named Rod Swenson. Rod wasn't a musician. He was a Yale art school grad, an intellectual with a fascination for radical ideas and media theory. He had this concept for a band that wasn't just about music, but about spectacle, destruction, total rejection of consumer culture. But a concept is just a concept. He needed a lightning rod, a force of nature, and he found her. Her name was Wendy O. Williams. Wendy wasn't your typical frontwoman. Before she was the queen of shock rock, she had lived a dozen lives. She left home as a teen, hitchhiked across the country, worked at a donut shop, even performed live sex shows in Times Square. She was fearless, and she had that untamed primal energy that Swenson knew was exactly what his project needed. He found his star, and together they created the Plasmatics. This wasn't going to be another band playing three chords at CBGB. It was going to be an all-out assault. And their live shows became stuff of legend. Not just because Wendy would appear on stage with a giant mohawk, electrical tape over her nipples, and a look of pure defiance. Swenson, as the band's manager and creative architect, meticulously planned every show as a piece of performance art. They weren't just gigs, they were events designed to provoke and shatter expectations. So while the band cranked out a brutal, high-speed fusion of punk and metal, the real show was the destruction. Wendy would take a running chainsaw, not to a log, but to a Gibson guitar, sending splinters flying into the audience in place of a solo. Speaker cabinets were sledgehammered into oblivion. Television sets, those symbols of passive consumerism, were summarily executed on stage every single night. It was a furious, visceral rejection of the comfortable rock star image. The message was clear. Nothing is sacred, especially not the very tools of rock and roll. Wendy and Rod saw the worship of material objects, whether it was a TV or a guitar, as this kind of sickness. And their answer? Blow it all up, literally. And this philosophy reached its fiery peak in 1980 on New York's Pier 62. To kick off a tour, the band announced a free concert. The main event was not a song, it was actually a stunt. Wendy got behind the wheel of a Cadillac, a car loaded to the gills with explosives, and aimed it at the stage. At the last possible second, she leaped from the moving vehicle, and the car slammed into the stage setup, triggering a massive explosion that obliterated all their equipment. The permits they had gotten for a crowd of about 5,000, but over 10,000 people showed up, jamming the streets, hanging from rooftops to get a glimpse of the chaos. The stunt cost them their entire advance for the upcoming album, New Hope for the Wretched. When a reporter asked if it was worth it, Wendy's response was simple and became her mantra. It was worth it because it showed that these are just things, and people shouldn't worship them. And this attitude, unsurprisingly, didn't sit well with everybody. When the Plasmatics took their circus of destruction to the UK, they were met with immediate hostility from the authorities. The Greater London Council, in particular, was horrified by their plans to blow up a car on stage at the prestigious Hammersmith Odeon. Citing safety concerns and Wendy's semi-nude stage presence, they shut the whole thing down. Before the official cancellation was even announced, police had already been dispatched to disperse the growing crowd of angry fans. The band was effectively banned in London, a badge of honor in the punk world, but a major blow to their tour. But the trouble in London was nothing compared to what was waiting for them in America's heartland. 2 days after a particularly wild performance on the national TV show Fridays, the band rolled into Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The reputation had preceded them. After a sold-out gig at the Palms nightclub, Rod Swenson was settling up with a promoter when a roadie ran in, panicked, telling him that Wendy had been arrested. As Rod went outside to see what was happening, another roadie came sprinting, screaming that the cops were beating the hell out of her. When Swenson got outside, he saw a scene of pure brutality. A circle of police officers surrounded Wendy. Inside the circle, a half-dozen cops were on top of her. One huge officer was kneeling on her back as she laid on the ground, her face already a mess of blood. And Swenson, seeing the woman he loved being pummeled, rushed through the police line and tried to pull them off of her. The cops then turned on him, dragged him between two cars, and started beating him with their nightsticks until he blacked out, waking up later in a pool of his own blood on the way to the hospital. He later found out what started it all. As the police were putting a handcuffed Wendy into the van, one of the officers allegedly reached under her shirt to, cop, no pun intended, a feel. Wendy, never wanted to take anything from anyone, turned and popped him in the face. And that's when they threw her to the ground and the beating began. Even with a broken nose and bleeding heavily, they tossed her into a paddy wagon and took her to the station. It wasn't until a female officer at the station saw her condition that she was finally taken to a hospital. The police were not subtle about their motives. They were enraged by the band's TV appearance and made vicious remarks, with one cop reportedly sneering that her band was made up of words that I just cannot say here on YouTube without getting smacked upside the hindquarters. But let's just say that one starts with N and one starts with Q. Next day, they were supposed to play in Cleveland, but Wendy and Rod were in a Milwaukee jail. Rod wanted to cancel the rest of the dates, but Wendy refused. Her face was swollen, her body was bruised, but she insisted they go on with the show the very next night. So they bailed out and drove to Cleveland. Now, the Cleveland Vice Squad was waiting for them, cameras in hand, ready to videotape the gig for any sign of obscenity. At the end of the show, still suffering from the effects of the beating the night before, Wendy collapsed on stage. Paramedics were called, but the moment she was revived, the Vice Squad moved in. They arrested her for indecent exposure, and in a moment of sheer absurdity for, quote, making obscene gestures with a sledgehammer, unquote, she was taken to the hospital again and eventually bailed out again. When the case finally went to trial, she was found not guilty. Back in Milwaukee, Rod and Wendy were facing serious charges, including assaulting a police officer, a felony that could have sent them to prison for years. The cops denied everything, even claiming that Rod had simply, quote-unquote, slipped on the ice. But then, a photograph surfaced. A local photographer had captured the moment the police were on top of Wendy, beating her. The visual evidence was undeniable. The picture destroyed the police's story and exposed the brutality that was going on. The charges were eventually dropped. The battle had been won, but the war against the establishment was definitely taking its toll. And it wasn't just the law that they were fighting. Sometimes the conflict came from within the rock and roll world itself. After touring with Kiss, where Gene Simmons had taken a keen interest in Wendy, another collaboration came knocking. Motorhead's manager proposed that Wendy record a duet with Lemmy Kilmister. The song choice was bizarre and brilliant, a punk metal demolition of Tammy Wynette's country classic Stand By Your Man. The plan was set, but the session was a disaster from the start. The members of Motorhead, Lemmy, Fast Eddie Clarke, Phil Filthy Animal Taylor, were at each other's throats and barely speaking. They showed up to the first rehearsal completely wrecked after a long tour and after party with Ozzy Osbourne, and they couldn't even be bothered to play. They then tried again in the studio in Toronto. Tensions were still high. During the recording, Lemmy and Fast Eddie got into a massive argument, and Eddie stormed out of the studio. It was the final straw. He quit Motorhead, later stating that his disgust with the collaboration and with Wendy O was the primary reason for his departure. The Plasmatics chaos was so potent, it had managed to break up one of the most legendary, indestructible bands in metal history. Meanwhile, Gene Simmons' interest had not faded. He wanted to produce the next Plasmatics album, but there was a catch. The band was locked in a bitter contract dispute with Capitol Records, and they couldn't use the Plasmatics name. Gene saw an opportunity. His interest, as Rod Swenson later recalled, wasn't in the Plasmatics as a band, it was in Wendy. He wanted to produce a Wendy O. Williams solo record, and he didn't care what it was called. And this led to the 1984 album, Wow, a record that featured the members of Kiss and was billed as Wendy O. Williams' solo project. And for some, it felt like a power move by Simmons to co-opt Wendy's fame and separate her from the band that had created her. The original lineup of the Plasmatics eventually dissolved after their most critically acclaimed album, Coup d'Etat. The constant pressure, legal battles, internal conflicts had fractured them. In a move that speaks to the bitterness of the split, when a retrospective DVD was released years later, original guitarist and co-founder Richie Stotts was reportedly edited out of the band's videos, his contributions almost erased from their official history. Wendy O. Williams tried to carry on, but the world was changing. The shock value that had once been so revolutionary was becoming mainstream. She had screamed and bled and blown things up to make a point, and now, as Debbie Harry of Blondie later noted, the thing she did would, quote, just be normal, unquote. After the band finally ended for good, Wendy retreated from the public eye. She moved to a quiet corner of Connecticut with Rod Swenson, the man who had been with her through it all. She got into working with animals, finding peace there, away from the noise and the violence. But the demons of a life that lived maximum volume never fully left her. On April 6, 1998, Wendy O. Williams called it quits for good on life. She left behind a letter explaining that she didn't believe it was right to take one's own life without deep thought, but that for her, the world had grown too quiet. She had pushed the boundaries so far that there was nowhere left to go. She was a woman who set fire to the world to see if it would burn, and in the end, she was consumed by her own flame. Smack that subscribe button. Smack the like button. I certainly do appreciate it, and thank you so much for watching. You friggin' rock.